There's a place in the Pacific Ocean called Saipan. Most people in the world have never heard of it. It is a small island. You could drive from one end to the other in about 20 minutes, and it sits so far out in the western Pacific that many Americans couldn't point to it on a map. But Saipan is American soil. The people who live there are American citizens. And right now, as you are watching this, those people are sitting inside whatever shelter they could find, listening to their roofs being torn apart in the dark. That is not an exaggeration. That is what is happening. Super Typhoon Sinlaku made landfall on the northern Mariana Islands on April 14th, 2026, today. And it did so in the middle of the night, which meant that people had no way to see what was happening around them. They could only hear it, the wind, the shattering of things they had built and owned and loved. One resident in the village of Susupe on Saipan looked out of his apartment window and saw a car sitting on top of 2 other cars in the parking lot below. The winds had picked up an entire vehicle and dropped it onto 2 others. He posted on Facebook, "I hope people will take an interest and help. The damage is really huge here." That man's name is Dongmin Lee, and he was still too afraid to go outside when he wrote those words. That's the story. Not the wind speeds, not the pressure readings, not the satellite imagery, though we'll talk about all of that. The story is that there are real people on those islands right now who are frightened and surrounded by destruction and waiting for the storm to pass. And most of the world doesn't know they exist. Let me tell you who they are and what they are going through. Saipan is the largest island in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, a chain of islands that stretches northward from Guam into the western Pacific. Together, Saipan and the surrounding islands are home to nearly 50,000 people. The island is perhaps best known, at least historically, as the site of one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific Theater in World War II. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians died on that island in 1944. After the war, the island rebuilt itself. It developed a tourism economy, resorts, diving, golf, and it built schools and hospitals and homes, and its people tried to live normal lives on a beautiful island in the middle of a very active ocean. The problem with living on a beautiful island in the middle of a very active ocean is that the ocean does not care how hard you have worked to build your life there. Typhoon Yutu hit Saipan in 2018 with winds of 175 miles per hour. It destroyed 85% of the Saipan campus of Northern Marianas College. Just that one fact alone should stop you for a moment. 85% of a college campus, reduced to rubble, in a single storm. The institution managed to secure $100 million in grant funding to rebuild. They were still rebuilding when the COVID-19 pandemic arrived. The tourism economy, which the islands depend on for survival, collapsed. The president of Northern Marianas College said this week, just as Sinlaku was approaching, "Just as we were finally beginning to recover and rebuild, we get hit with this. That is the cycle these people live in. Not just storms, but the long, painful work of recovery between storms, only to be knocked back again before they are ever fully standing." Glenn Hunter grew up on Saipan. He has lived through more typhoons than most people on Earth, which should tell you something about the kind of life Pacific Islanders lead. He stood outside his home and watched at least 3 tin roofs fly past his yard during Sinlaku. 3 roofs from 3 different buildings, flying through the air like pieces of paper. He described rain coming through every crevice of his concrete home, water seeping in from directions he couldn't predict or stop. It was a losing battle because the rain was coming through everywhere, he said. Every house is just flooded with water, no matter what type of structure you're in. And then he added something that I want you to hold on to. He said this felt like the strongest typhoon he had ever experienced. This man, who has lived his whole life on that island, who has weathered storms that most of us would consider unsurvivable, he said this was the worst. Now let's talk about what Sinlaku actually is, because the numbers are genuinely extraordinary. This storm reached sustained winds of 180 miles per hour over open ocean. That is the equivalent of a Category 5 hurricane, the highest category on the scale. But Sinlaku didn't just barely touch Category 5. It was a super typhoon, which is a designation used in the Pacific for storms with sustained winds above 150 miles per hour. By the time it made landfall over Tinian and Saipan, it had weakened slightly to a strong Category 4, carrying sustained winds of 150 miles per hour. But here is what matters. A Category 4 hurricane is still a catastrophic, life-threatening storm. The difference between a Category 4 and a Category 5 on the ground is not the difference between bad and terrible. They are both terrible. What changes between those categories is whether the terrible is survivable or not. Sinlaku is the strongest tropical cyclone anywhere on Earth this year, not just in the Pacific, on the entire planet. It is only the second Category 5 tropical cyclone of 2026, following Horatio, which churned through the South Indian Ocean in February. What is unusual about Sinlaku is that it reached this intensity in April, which meteorologists will tell you is early. Typhoon season in the Pacific typically peaks in late summer and fall, similar to Atlantic hurricane season. Getting a super typhoon in April is unusual. It is one of only a handful of Category 5 typhoons ever recorded this early in the year. The meteorologists are already pointing to why this is happening. The ocean is warming toward what appears to be a strong El Niño event for 2026 to 2027. El Niño conditions warm the surface waters of the Pacific, and warm ocean water is the fuel that powers typhoons. A warmer ocean means a more energetic storm. Sinlaku is, in this sense, not just a disaster for the northern Mariana Islands. It is also a signal about the kind of storm seasons that may be ahead of us as the ocean continues to warm. This year's storms are beginning earlier and strengthening faster than historical averages would suggest. That is not a coincidence. That is physics. But I want to come back to the people, because the science of storms can sometimes make us forget that storms happen to people. The mayor of Saipan, Ramon Camacho, was watching the storm from his office as Sinlaku made landfall. He was watching the glass door to his office, wondering if it would hold. He told reporters, "It's hitting us hard. It's so difficult for us to respond with this heavy rain, heavy wind to rescue people. Objects are just flying left and right." Think about what it means to be the mayor of a city during a typhoon of this strength. You cannot send emergency responders out into 150-mile-per-hour winds. They would be killed. You can only wait. You can only hope that the people who sheltered before the storm arrived found somewhere strong enough to hold. The National Weather Service had forecast rainfall of 15 to 25 inches for Tinian and Saipan, with storm surge, the wall of ocean water that a typhoon pushes ahead of itself, reaching 5 to 8 feet. Along windward-facing beaches, wave action could drive water 10 to 15 feet higher than normal sea level. When water moves at that speed and at that height, it does not flood, it destroys. It tears foundations out from under buildings. It fills ground floors in minutes. It carries debris that becomes its own weapon. People who have survived storm surge often describe it not as water rising, but as water attacking. To the south of Saipan, Guam, a much larger island with about 170,000 residents and several major United States military installations, was hit by the weaker outer bands of Sinlaku. Wind gusts on Guam reached 73 miles per hour. Flash flooding broke out. Schools were closed, and the governor announced they would stay closed until he declared conditions safe for students to return. Guam's water authority reported multiple power outages across the island. The military, which controls roughly 1/3 of the land on Guam and uses the island as a critical hub for Pacific operations, ordered personnel to shelter in place. The American Red Cross and its partner organizations were sheltering more than 1,000 residents across Guam and the Northern Marianas. 1,000 people who had nowhere safe to stay, sleeping in emergency shelters while the storm passed over. President Trump approved emergency disaster declarations for both Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands before Sinlaku made landfall, and FEMA dispatched nearly 100 staff members along with other personnel. That is the right thing to do, and it matters, but emergency declarations and FEMA staff cannot stop a 150-mile-per-hour wind from tearing a roof off a building. They matter in the aftermath. During the storm itself, the only thing that protects people is the structure around them, and many of the structures on these islands are not built to withstand what Sinlaku brought. There is something I want you to understand about what it feels like to be inside a catastrophic typhoon, because I think most of us who have never experienced one imagine it as a very strong rainstorm. It is not. The wind at 150 miles per hour is not just fast. It creates a kind of pressure against every surface it contacts that is almost incomprehensible from the outside. Windows fail not just from flying debris, but from the sustained pressure of the wind itself pushing against them, flexing them, until they break inward. Roofs are lifted not because they were poorly built, but because the pressure difference between the outside of the roof and the inside of the building creates a lifting force. The roof is essentially trying to fly, and the only thing stopping it is how well it is attached to the walls beneath it. When that lift exceeds what the fasteners can hold, the roof is gone. And once the roof is gone, the walls begin to fail. And once the walls begin to fail, the structure is no longer a shelter. It is a danger. Glenn Hunter watched 3 roofs fly past his yard. Those roofs came from buildings. Those buildings, without their roofs, were someone's home or business or school. When the storm passes and the residents of Saipan emerge to assess what happened, they will find a landscape that has been fundamentally rearranged. Trees thrown across roads, cars flipped and stacked, buildings open to the sky. The recovery process will take not weeks, but years, and even then there will be things, irreplaceable things, personal things, that simply cannot be rebuilt. There's also a dimension to this story that I think gets lost in coverage of disasters in remote places, and I want to name it directly. These are American citizens. The people of the Northern Mariana Islands hold United States citizenship. They have no voting representation in Congress, and they cannot vote in presidential elections, which is an ongoing and troubling aspect of how the United States treats its island territories. But they are Americans, and they pay taxes, and they have served in the United States military at rates that are among the highest per capita of any state or territory in the nation. When a hurricane hits Florida or North Carolina, the national response is immediate and visible. When a super typhoon hits Saipan, the response is slower to materialize in public attention, if it materializes at all. The people of Saipan deserve the same urgency of care and attention. Sinlaku is now moving northwest and beginning to weaken slightly as it approaches the sparsely populated volcanic islands of the far northern Marianas. The storm is expected to continue weakening over the coming days as it moves over cooler ocean waters and encounters stronger upper-level winds. Within about 5 days, it will begin what meteorologists call extratropical transition, the process by which a tropical storm loses its organized warm core structure and merges into the mid-latitude weather systems of the higher latitudes. By then, for Saipan and Guam and Tinian, it will be over. The winds will have dropped, the rain will have stopped, and the sun will come out, and the people of those islands will walk outside and begin to count what they have lost. For context on the historical rarity of what just happened, the last Category 5 tropical cyclone to make a direct landfall on a United States territory in the Pacific before Sinlaku was Super Typhoon Karen in 1962, 64 years ago. In the intervening decades, Guam and the Marianas have been hit by powerful typhoons, including Mawar in 2023 and Yutu in 2018, but nothing at the strength Sinlaku carried at its peak. The fact that this storm reached such extreme intensity so early in the year, in a year that climate scientists are already flagging as likely to produce a strong El Niño, should give us pause. These islands are not prepared, financially, structurally, or emotionally, to absorb a catastrophic typhoon every few years. The recovery from Yutu was still incomplete when Sinlaku arrived, if the storms are becoming stronger and the gaps between them are not long enough for full recovery. Then the question facing these communities is not just how to survive each individual storm, but whether they can continue to sustain themselves at all. That is a heavy thing to say, but it is honest, and I think these communities deserve honesty more than they deserve reassurance. The name Sinlaku, according to the National Weather Service meteorologist who discussed it, comes from a goddess of Kozre, one of the federated states of Micronesia. Before reaching the Marianas, the storm had already struck the outer islands and atolls of Chuuk, also in the federated states of Micronesia, causing significant damage there as well. So the destruction began even before the storm reached American territory, in communities that have even fewer resources and even less international attention than Saipan and Guam already receive. A goddess of destruction, named after a goddess. There is something almost unbearably fitting about that. What comes next is recovery, and recovery is the hardest part. Harder in many ways than the storm itself, because the storm at least has a defined end. Recovery does not. The people of Saipan will spend the coming weeks clearing debris and trying to restore power and water. They will spend months repairing or rebuilding homes. They will spend years trying to rebuild an economy that was already struggling. And in some corner of all of that, they will be watching the ocean, because in the Pacific, the ocean always brings another storm, and the question is never whether it is coming, but when. If you want to help the people of the Northern Mariana Islands, the American Red Cross has active operations there right now. Organizations working in disaster relief in the Pacific have long struggled with underfunding compared to mainland disasters, and the gap in resources is real. The most useful thing most of us can do from a distance is make sure these communities and their situation stays visible, that the people making decisions about aid and reconstruction know that the rest of the world is paying attention. And I think that matters. I think visibility matters. I think the fact that 50,000 people on an island most Americans cannot name are sitting in the wreckage of their homes tonight is something that deserves more than a brief headline. They are not statistics. They are people who built lives in a beautiful and difficult place and who are now trying to hold those lives together in the dark, in the wind, in the rain, waiting for morning. That is all for today's video. If this kind of storytelling, real events, real people, told honestly, is what you are looking for, then please subscribe. Because this is what this channel is going to be. Not numbers for their own sake, not fear for clicks, just the truth about what is happening in our world, told with the care it deserves. I will see you in the next one.